When a high-dose psychedelic state turns against the user, the subjective experience is absolute terror. The mind's anchored to reality doesn't slip, it shatters, leaving the individual trapped in an environment of escalating panic. In modern research, the phrase bad trip has been struck from the clinical vocabulary. It is a scientifically useless term that flattens everything from a wave of mild nausea to an acute psychiatric emergency into one concept. The accurate description is a challenging experience. A 2016 survey of nearly 2,000 people reveals a staggering paradox. 39% ranked this among the hardest experiences of their lives. Yet, looking back, the overwhelming majority of that highly distressed subset still rated the experience as deeply meaningful. A challenging experience is not a pharmacological malfunction. It is the exact same neural mechanism that produces awe, simply pointed at something the brain interprets as an existential threat. To understand how that threat is generated, we have to look deep inside the cortex, arriving at the surface of a single deep-layer pyramidal neuron. Every classic psychedelic begins its work here, through strong agonism at the 5-HT2A receptor. Binding at the site does not directly manufacture fear or bliss. Instead, it initiates a systemic cascade that alters how the entire brain communicates. This single bind-in event sets off 3 simultaneous network failures, dismantling the brain's standard operating parameters. Removing these standard filters makes the mind completely vulnerable to its environment, setting the biological stage for either profound insight or absolute terror. This diagram illustrates the corticostriato-thalamocortical circuit, the physical circuit board governing what you perceive. The blue structure is the thalamus, the brain's sensory filter, actively blocking 99% of environmental noise and internal memory data. When the 5-HT2A receptors are strongly activated, this thalamic gate physically widens and begins to fracture. Immediately, an unscreened, chaotic flood of raw sensory, emotional, and memory data violently surges upward into conscious awareness. The sheer volume of this arriving data creates a state of profound disorientation. Normally, your brain would quickly categorize and dismiss this extra noise, but the psychedelic compound prevents this routine mental housekeeping. Stripped of the ability to selectively ignore stimuli, every sight, sound, and buried memory feels impossibly intense and completely unavoidable. We now look at the prefrontal cortex, highlighted in red, the brain's executive control center. It normally provides top-down control, contextualizing fear by sending a steady downward rhythm telling the nervous system, you are safe. The psychedelic state suppresses these network connections. The executive brakes dissolve entirely, and that calming voice goes quiet. This leaves the amygdala, the brain's primitive threat center, highlighted in orange, entirely unguarded. The amygdala is now forced to process the massive dynamic data flood entirely on its own. Uninhibited, it mistakenly tags ordinary incoming perceptions, a shadow, an ambient sound, a passing thought, as urgently dangerous or catastrophic. Terror in this state is not a hallucination. It is raw emotions stripped of logical perspective, the brain's survival machinery running at maximum capacity. Layered on top of this unfiltered fear is the breakdown of the default mode network, the system responsible for maintaining the narrative sense of self. Letting go of the self model feels like mystical unity. Resisting that loss feels like literal annihilation. The Challenging Experience questionnaire maps this exact resistance. When the mind fights the dissolution of the ego, it manifests precisely as the death and insanity factors, which spike outward on this chart. In 2020, researchers identified a specific neurochemical biomarker for this terrifying divergence. This line graph shows that high levels of glutamate in the medial prefrontal cortex correlate strictly with the negatively experienced, terrifying version of ego dissolution. This spike in glutamate is a biological marker of the brain aggressively resisting the loss of its central organizing structure. The mind is not broken during a highly challenging trip. An unfiltered, deregulated system is doing exactly what it evolved to do, assuming a catastrophic threat. There is a firm line between a difficult psychological passage and genuine medical harm. For individuals with a personal or family history of schizophrenia or bipolar disorder, these compounds act as absolute contraindications because they can precipitate prolonged psychosis or mania. There is also the rare physical risk of hallucinogen persistent perception disorder, where visual disturbances linger long after the drug has cleared the system. Furthermore, acute panic can lead to genuinely dangerous behavior if a person is left alone, which is why clinical trials mandate strict, constant supervision. Psychological difficulty may often be therapeutically necessary, but unromanticized biological vulnerabilities and uncontained panic represent real dangers that demand strict clinical screening protocols. This matrix contrasts biological risks with modifiable variables. Dose, physical comfort, and social support dictate if a deregulated state becomes an emergency or a breakthrough. Applying these controls soothes the amygdala, acting as external top-down control. When this neural openness is successfully supported, it creates what clinicians call an emotional breakthrough, allowing a patient to confront buried trauma or grief. Skilled clinical guides do not try to abort or medicate a difficult psychedelic passage. They aim to hold it. Verbal and physical reassurance from a guide temporarily replaces the offline prefrontal cortex, manually reminding the patient's nervous system that they are safe. Preparation and setting provide the required safety scaffolding for a dismantled brain, serving a function more critical than simple aesthetic comfort. The goal of psychedelic therapy was never to avoid all difficulty. The goal is to engineer an environment where the brain's most terrifying vulnerability becomes survivable, integratable, and ultimately transformative.